What if everything you thought you knew about the Vikings was only half the story? We picture them as fierce warriors, storming the coast of Europe with axes and fire, their longships slicing through icy waters. But beneath the surface of this familiar legend lies a world far darker, more intimate, and more disturbing than most people ever imagine. The Vikings' most shocking weapon wasn't forged from steel or wood. It was woven into the very fabric of their society. A weapon of power, humiliation, and control. Sex. This is not the sanitized saga of Norse heroes and gods. This is a story of how the Vikings used sexuality as a tool of dominance, a currency of conquest, and a means of psychological warfare. Their sexual practices were not just private acts, but public spectacles, legal punishments, and even rituals of death. To understand the true nature of Viking society, we must look beyond the battlefield and into the longhouses, the slave markets, and the shadowy corners of their laws and legends. Let's begin with the most visible and yet, in many ways, the most invisible aspect of Viking sexuality: slavery. For the Vikings, slaves or thralls were not just laborers. They were commodities, status symbols, and, most disturbingly, object of sexual exploitation. The Viking Age, which spanned from the late 8th to the 11th century, saw the rise of a vast and systematic slave trade that stretched from the British Isles to the steppes of Russia. Raiding was not just about gold or land. It was about people. Every successful raid brought back captives, men, women, and children, who would be sold in bustling markets like Hedeby, Birka, and Dublin, or kept as property in Viking households. But what made Viking slavery so uniquely brutal was the way it blurred the lines between violence, sex, and power. In Viking law, slaves had no rights. They were referred to in the neuter gender, linguistically stripped of personhood, and legally equated with livestock. Their bodies were available for any use their owners desired, and sexual exploitation was not just common, it was expected. The most attractive female slaves, often captured in raids on monasteries or villages, could find themselves paraded, abused, and sold for the highest price. The Arabic diplomat Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who encountered Vikings on the Volga River in 922, described how slave girls were sexually abused by their owners in full view of others, their suffering a spectacle for the tribe. Yet, the horror did not end with daily life. For some slaves, the ultimate violation came in death. Archaeological discoveries in Scandinavia have revealed graves where slaves were buried alongside their masters, often after being killed as part of elaborate funeral rituals. In one chilling account, Ibn Fadlan described the funeral of a Viking chieftain, where a slave girl was chosen, likely under duress, to follow her master into the afterlife. Over several days, she was subjected to ritualized sexual acts by multiple men, each one telling her to deliver a message of love to the dead. She was then strangled and stabbed, her body placed beside her master's in a burning ship, a final act of possession that blurred the boundaries between sex, death, and sacrifice. Why did the Vikings do this? Part of the answer lies in their beliefs about power and the afterlife. For the Norse, the world was a place of constant struggle, where strength and dominance were the highest virtues. To die with honor was to carry that strength into the next world. By forcing a slave to submit sexually and then die for her master, the Vikings believed they were transferring life force, loyalty, and even sexual potency to the deceased. It was a ritual that both terrified and awed those who witnessed it, reinforcing the absolute authority of the elite and the utter helplessness of the enslaved. But the use of sex as a weapon was not limited to slaves. In Viking society, sexual humiliation was a tool of psychological warfare, wielded both against enemies and within their own communities. During raids, Vikings didn't just kill or capture, they broke spirits. One of the most notorious practices was the so-called shame stroke, a ritualized act of violence in which a defeated enemy's buttocks were slashed or stabbed, marking him as sexually passive and therefore dishonored. In the hyper-masculine world of the Vikings, to be seen as passive in any sexual context was to lose all status, all honor, and all hope of redemption. This was not just symbolic. Sagas and legal texts describe how captured kings and warriors were sometimes subjected to public sexual abuse, their humiliation witnessed by crowds. The message was clear. To resist the Vikings was to risk not just death, but fate worse than death, the destruction of one's manhood, reputation, and place in the world. The psychological impact was devastating. Some victims took their own lives rather than return home in disgrace. Others became outcasts, their shame a permanent scar. Even within Viking society, sexual violence and humiliation were used to enforce order and punish transgressors. Men accused of sexual passivity, whether true or not, could lose their legal rights, their property, and their very identity as free people. The law recognized the power of sexual reputation. A man who was called unmanly could demand satisfaction through combat, and in some cases, even kill his accuser without penalty. The stakes were life and death, and the boundaries between public and private, violence and intimacy, were constantly shifting. What emerges from this dark tapestry is a society where sex was never just about pleasure or reproduction. It was about power, who had it, who lost it, and how it could be taken, displayed, or destroyed. The Vikings understood that to conquer a people, it was not enough to take their land or their gold. You had to break their spirit, rewrite their identities, and make them fear not just your weapons, but your very presence. Sexual violence, ritual humiliation, and the absolute control of bodies. These are the tools that made the Vikings more than just raiders. They were psychological warriors, masters of terror, and architect a legacy that still haunts the edges of history. If the Vikings' use of sexual power seems shocking to us today, it's because it was designed to be. Their society was built on a foundation of visible, public dominance, where the boundaries between violence, sex, and social order were deliberately blurred. But to truly understand how these practices shaped the Viking world, we need to look deeper into the daily lives of both the enslaved and the free, and how the lines between them could sometimes shift in unexpected ways. For most thralls, life was a relentless cycle of labor, fear, and uncertainty. They worked in the darkest corners of the longhouse, slept beside livestock, and were denied even the most basic rights. In the eyes of the law, they were property, bought, sold, inherited, and punished at their owner's whim. The language of the time reflected this dehumanization. In old Norse legal texts, slaves were referred to in the neuter gender, as if they were objects rather than people. Their value was measured not in their humanity, but in their utility and desirability. Yet, even within this brutal system, there were rare stories of transformation. Some slaves, through skill or luck, could earn their freedom. The rune stone from Horning in Jutland tells the story of Toki Smith, a craftsman who was granted his freedom by his master and commemorated for it. Such cases were exceptional, but they reveal a society where status, though rigid, was not entirely fixed. A particularly skilled artisan, a beautiful concubine, or a loyal servant could sometimes rise above their station, though always at the mercy of those in power. For most, however, the threat of sexual exploitation was ever present. Female slaves, especially those considered attractive or high status, were at constant risk. They could be forced into concubinage, used to produce children for their masters, or paraded and abused for the entertainment of others. The account of Ibn Fadlan, who witnessed the sexual abuse of slave girls by their Viking owners, is not an isolated story. Archaeological evidence from Dublin, York, and Birka has revealed shackles, chains, and holding areas that point to the organized, systematic nature of Viking slavery. In some settlements, up to 30% of the population may have been enslaved, a staggering figure that underscores how deeply the economy and social order depended on forced labor and sexual dominance. But the Vikings' appetite for sexual power was not limited to their own households. Their raids across Europe were often targeted with chilling precision. Monasteries, isolated villages, and coastal settlements were chosen not just for their wealth, but for their vulnerability. The Vikings knew that certain places offered the best harvest of human cargo, especially women and children, who could be sold for high prices or kept as concubines. The slave markets of Hedeby, Balgar, and even distant cities like Constantinople became hubs for this trade, connecting the Viking world to a vast network of buyers and sellers that stretched from the North Atlantic to the Mediterranean and beyond. The demand for female slaves was driven by more than just sexual desire. In Viking society, women were also valued for their skills, especially in textile production, which was essential for making the sails that powered the great longships. Some historians believe that the need for skilled labor was one of the main reasons the Vikings began raiding in such large numbers. Fleets of hundreds of ships required vast quantities of cloth, rope, and other materials, much of it produced by enslaved women. In this way, the sexual and economic exploitation of captives became intertwined, fueling both the expansion of Viking power and the machinery of their society. Yet, the fate of enslaved women was not always the same. While many suffered unimaginable abuse, others could, under certain circumstances, achieve a measure of respect or even influence. A beautiful or high-status concubine might become a favorite companion, her children recognized as legitimate heirs. Skilled female slaves could rise to positions of authority within the household, managing other servants or overseeing important work. But these exceptions only highlight the rule. For most, life was a constant negotiation between survival and submission, with the ever-present threat of violence hanging over every moment. The psychological impact of this system extended far beyond the individual victims. Entire communities learned to fear the arrival of Viking ships, knowing that capture meant a life of humiliation, forced labor, and abuse. The terror spread by the Vikings was not just a byproduct of their raids. It was a deliberate strategy. By making examples of their captives, by using sexual violence and public humiliation as tools of control, the Vikings created a climate of fear that often preceded them. Villages would sometimes be abandoned at the first sight of sails on the horizon. The mere rumor of Viking practices enough to send people fleeing into the forests. But the use of sex as a weapon was not confined to the conquered. Within Viking society itself, sexual reputation was a matter of life and death. For free men, honor was everything. From childhood, boys were taught that their status depended on their ability to dominate, not just in battle, but in every aspect of life, including the bedroom. The division between the active and passive roles in sex was rigidly enforced. To be accused of sexual passivity, or to be labeled with slurs like "ar" or "urgy," was to risk total social ruin. The law codes of medieval Iceland made it clear a man who was called unmanly could lose his legal rights, his property, and his place in the community. In some cases, he could even be killed by the man he insulted. The law recognizing that an attack on sexual honor was an attack on life itself. This obsession with sexual dominance created a society where violence and intimacy were inseparable. Public punishments for sexual crimes often included acts of humiliation or mutilation, designed to strip the offender of his manhood in the eyes of the community. Sagas describe festivals where prisoners were forced to perform degrading acts, their suffering a form of entertainment that reinforced the social hierarchy. Archaeological evidence from execution sites shows signs of ritualized mutilation, including cuts to the pelvis and buttocks that match the accounts of shamestroke. These were not random acts of cruelty, but calculated strategies to maintain order and instill fear. The result was a world where everyone, slave or free, man or woman, lived under the shadow of sexual power. The boundaries between victim and perpetrator, honor and shame, were constantly shifting, enforced by a system that valued dominance above all else. For the Vikings, sex was never just a private matter. It was a public performance, a weapon of war, and a tool of control that shaped every aspect of their society. To truly grasp the shocking nature of Viking sexual practices, we must also examine how these customs were embedded in their laws, beliefs, and even their mythology. The Norse legal code, sagas, and oral traditions reveal a society obsessed with boundaries between freedom and slavery, honor and shame, life and death. And nowhere were these boundaries more fiercely policed than in matters of sexuality. In the Viking worldview, masculinity was not just a personal trait, but a public asset. A man's reputation for dominance, both in battle and in bed, was the foundation of his social standing. The worst insult one could hurl at a man was to accuse him of being unmanly, not just cowardly, but sexually passive. This was not mere name-calling. It was a legal and social death sentence. The Icelandic Grágis law code, for example, spelled out the consequences for such accusations. If a man called another arg or urgy, he was challenging his very existence as a free person. The accused could demand a duel, and if he killed his accuser, the law would stand with him. In this way, the Vikings weaponized sexuality, making it a matter of life and death, a trigger for blood feuds that could last generations. This obsession with sexual reputation extended to the treatment of enemies. When the Vikings captured rival warriors, especially those of high status. They often subjected them to public sexual humiliation. The act of shame stroke, cutting or stabbing the buttocks, was a symbolic way of marking the defeated as sexually passive, stripping them of their honor and masculinity. Sometimes the humiliation was even more explicit, with sagas describing acts of forced sexual submission designed to break the spirit of a vanquished. These rituals were not just about individual suffering. They were public performances meant to send a message to all who witnessed them. To resist the Vikings was to risk not just death, but the total destruction of one's identity. The psychological impact of these practices cannot be overstated. In a world where honor was everything, to be marked as sexually passive was to become a social ghost, alive, but stripped of all rights and respect. Many victims of such humiliation chose suicide over returning home in disgrace. Others lived as outcasts, their shame a permanent stain that could never be washed away. The Vikings understood that true power was not just about physical strength, but about the ability to define reality itself. To decide who was a man, who was a slave, who was worthy of life or death. But the boundaries of Viking sexuality were not only enforced through violence and law, they were also woven into the fabric of daily life, from the structure of the longhouse to the rituals of marriage and death. In the typical Viking household, slaves lived in the darkest, coldest corners, often sharing space with animals. Their presence was a constant reminder of the power of the free, a living symbol of what could happen to anyone who lost their place in the social order. The sexual availability of slaves was taken for granted, their bodies used to satisfy desires, produce children, or cement alliances. Yet, paradoxically, some slaves, especially those with rare skills or beauty, could rise to positions of influence, blurring the lines between property and personhood. Marriage itself was a complex institution, shaped by both affection and calculation. While some Viking marriages were based on mutual respect, many were arranged for political or economic reasons. Women, even freeborn, had limited rights compared to men, though they could own property and initiate divorce in some cases. The practice of polygamy among the elite further complicated matters, creating households where wives, concubines, and slaves all vied for status and security. For many women, the threat of sexual violence was never far away, whether from raiders, masters, or even their own kin. The role of women in Viking society was thus deeply ambivalent. On one hand, sagas celebrate powerful female figures, shield maidens, queens, and goddesses who defy convention and shape the fate of nations. On the other, the reality for most women, especially those enslaved or captured, was one of vulnerability and exploitation. The DNA evidence from Iceland, showing that up to two-thirds of the female founding population had Gaelic origins, speaks volumes about the scale of sexual conquest and forced migration. These women, taken from their homes in Ireland or Scotland, became the mothers of a new generation, their stories largely lost to history, but written in the genes of their descendants. Religion and ritual also played a role in shaping Viking sexual practices. The Norse believed that the afterlife mirrored the struggles of this world, and that the dead required not just weapons and treasure, but companionship and service. The ritual sacrifice of slaves at funerals, often accompanied by sexual acts, was a way of ensuring that the elite would not be alone in the next world. These ceremonies, described in detail by Ibn Fadlan and confirmed by archaeological finds, were both terrifying and awe-inspiring, reinforcing the absolute power of the chieftain and the utter helplessness of the enslaved. Yet, even as Christianity began to spread through Scandinavia, challenging old beliefs and customs, the legacy of Viking sexuality persisted. The church condemned slavery and sexual violence, but the transition was slow and uneven. Legal codes from as late as the 13th century still contained rules about slaves, and the practice of sexual exploitation did not disappear overnight. The tension between old and new values created a society in flux, where the boundaries of power, sex, and identity were constantly being renegotiated. In the end, what makes the sexual practices of the Vikings so shocking is not just their brutality, but their complexity. This was a world where sex was never just about pleasure or reproduction, but about power, status, and survival. The Vikings understood that to control a person's body was to control their fate, and they wielded that power with a ruthlessness that still echoes through history. Their legacy is not just one of conquest and adventure, but of psychological warfare, social engineering, and enduring struggle for dignity in the face of overwhelming force. As we reach the end of this journey into the most shocking sexual practices of Viking raiders, it becomes clear that the true legacy of the Vikings is far more complicated and far more unsettling than the popular image of horned helmets and heroic battles. Their world was one where power was measured not just in victories on the battlefield, but in the ability to dominate every aspect of life, including the most intimate and vulnerable parts of the human experience. The Vikings' use of sexuality as a weapon was not an accident in history, nor was it simply the product of a violent age. It was a deliberate system woven into their laws, their rituals, and their very sense of identity. By making sex a tool of humiliation, control, and even spiritual transition, the Vikings created a society where fear and desire were inseparable and where the boundaries between victim and victor were constantly shifting. Their practices were designed to break spirits, to erase identities, and to ensure that their power would be felt long after the sword were sheathed and the fires had burned out. Yet, even in this world of brutality, there were moments of resistance, transformation, and unexpected humanity. Some slaves found ways to earn their freedom, to carve out a place for themselves in a society that saw them as less than human. Some women, despite being taken as captives, became the mothers of new communities, their strength and resilience written into the DNA of generations to come. And as Christianity spread, bringing new ideas about dignity and compassion, the old ways began to fade, though not without leaving deep scars on societies they touched. The echoes of Viking sexual practices can still be felt today, not just in the genetic legacy of their descendants, but in the ways we think about power, gender, and violence. The stories of the thralls, the concubines, the humiliated warriors, and the chieftains who ruled through fear remind us that history is never as simple as legend would have us believe. It is a tapestry of pain and survival, of cruelty and adaptation, of systems that can both destroy and, sometimes, unexpectedly create. So, what should we take away from this dark chapter of the Viking story? Perhaps it is a realization that the past is not just a mirror, but a warning. The Vikings understood that true dominance was not just about taking land or treasure, but about controlling the very meaning of honor, shame, and identity. Their world was built on the power to define who mattered and who did not, who was free and who was property, who would be remembered and who would be forgotten. In the end, the most shocking thing about the Vikings may not be their violence or their conquests, but the way they used the most intimate parts of human life as instruments of power. Their story challenges us to look beyond the myths, to confront the uncomfortable truths of our own history, and to ask ourselves how much of that ancient logic still lingers in the world we live in today.